The quiet hum of the idyllic suburban life often masks the most profound disturbances, a truth that lay buried for years beneath the manicured lawns and serene facades of one particular Hollywood enclave. What began as a whisper in the wind, a barely perceptible tremor in the carefully constructed world of a beloved figure, would eventually erupt into a chilling revelation, leaving behind a legacy forever shadowed by an unseen darkness. If you're watching on TV, point your phone's camera at the QR code on the screen and subscribe to the channel now. Here, you'll find real stories that almost no one had the courage to tell. The year was 2024, and the world still revered Rob Reiner, a director whose name was synonymous with cinematic triumphs, a man whose work had shaped generations. He was, by all accounts, an institution. His life, from the outside, appeared a tapestry of success, woven with critical acclaim, box office hits, and a seemingly unblemished personal life. Yet beneath this polished exterior, a different narrative was quietly unfolding, a silent descent into a psychological labyrinth that few could have ever predicted. The setting for this unraveling was his expansive estate in Brentwood, a sanctuary of wealth and privilege. The house itself, a sprawling testament to his achievements, stood as a silent witness to the escalating internal turmoil. In the months leading up to the unforeseen tragedy, the once vibrant atmosphere of the Reiner residence began to subtly shift. What was once a hub of creative energy and warm family gatherings slowly morphed into a place of increasing solitude and palpable tension. Those closest to him, the handful of staff and long-term associates who formed the inner circle, were the first to notice the subtle changes. Reiner, known for his robust health and tireless work ethic, started to exhibit an uncharacteristic fatigue. His sharp wit, a hallmark of his public persona, occasionally faltered, replaced by a vacant stare or an unexpected irritability. Conversations, once lively and engaging, became stilted, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. It was as if a vital spark within him was slowly dimming, imperceptibly at first, then with a growing unsettling certainty. His daily routine, once meticulously structured, began to fray at the edges. Early morning walks, a ritual he cherished, grew shorter, then ceased altogether. His usually disciplined diet gave way to erratic eating patterns, often accompanied by an increased consumption of alcohol, a habit he had always maintained with strict moderation. The staff, accustomed to his demanding but always professional demeanor, found themselves navigating a new landscape of unpredictable moods and withdrawn silences. They exchanged worried glances, hushed whispers in the expansive corridors, but no one dared to voice their growing concerns directly to the formidable director. The aura of respect, even reverence, that surrounded him made intervention seem an impossible task. The subtle signs of distress extended beyond his personal habits. His work, the very fabric of his identity, began to show the strain. Projects that were once approached with enthusiastic vigor now languished. Commitments were postponed, and creative meetings became increasingly rare. Colleagues, initially understanding of what they assumed was a temporary creative block, grew increasingly perplexed by his sudden inaccessibility. Phone calls went unanswered, emails unreturned. The vibrant, engaged artist they knew seemed to be receding into a self-imposed isolation. One particular incident, though seemingly minor at the time, stands out in retrospect as a chilling premonition. During a casual dinner with a longtime friend and collaborator, Reiner abruptly excused himself, claiming an urgent matter. His friend, surprised by the sudden departure, later found him in the study, staring blankly at a framed photograph of his younger self, a profound sadness etched across his face. When asked if everything was all right, Reiner simply shook his head, a single, unbidden tear tracing a path down his cheek. He offered no explanation, merely a dismissive wave of his hand, and retreated further into his own world. The atmosphere in the house became heavy, thick with unspoken anxieties. The once bustling household grew quiet, the sounds of life replaced by a pervasive stillness. The staff moved with a newfound caution, their footsteps softened, their voices lowered, as if afraid to disturb a fragile peace. The tension was almost tangible, a silent hum beneath the surface of their everyday tasks. They observed his increasingly erratic behavior. Late-night wanderings through the house, the persistent clinking of ice in a glass from his study, the distant murmur of a television playing in an empty room. The most disturbing aspect was the silence that surrounded his decline. No grand outbursts, no dramatic confrontations. Just a slow, almost imperceptible withdrawal, a quiet fading that seemed to absorb the very light from the grand estate. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a chilling prelude to the tragedy that was silently forming, unnoticed and unchecked, beneath the placid surface of an iconic life. The quiet was almost suffocating. An oppressive blanket that settled over the Brentwood mansion, hinting at a hidden truth that was on the verge of breaking through. A truth that, once exposed, would forever alter the perception of a man once thought to be beyond reproach. The stage was set, not for a grand drama, but for a silent, unsettling revelation. The heavy silence of the Brentwood estate was finally shattered on the afternoon of Sunday. December 14, 2025 it was, a day that began with the deceptive ordinary of a Southern California weekend, golden light filtering through the trees, the distant sound of traffic, and the quiet expectation of a routine appointment. At approximately 3:30 p.m., a massage therapist arrived at the gates of the Reiner residence, expecting a professional session with the director. When repeated attempts to reach the household went unanswered, an uneasy intuition took hold. The gates remained closed, the house unusually still. Sensing something was deeply wrong, the therapist contacted the couple's daughter, Romy Reiner, who lived only a short distance away. Romy arrived within minutes, her presence a frantic contrast to the chilling stillness of the property. Using her own keys, she entered the house through a side entrance. The air inside was heavy, the silence no longer peaceful but oppressive. As she moved through the familiar halls toward the master suite, the reality of the situation began to unfold in a series of horrific fragments. She discovered her father Rob lying in the bedroom. The scene was one of sudden, clinical violence, a sharp departure from the warmth that usually defined the space. In a state of pure adrenaline-fueled shock, Romy fled the house, stumbling back into the sunlight and collapsing in the arms of her roommate, who had followed her. At 3:38 p.m., the roommate placed the call that would change everything, reporting a medical emergency that would soon be reclassified as a double homicide. When the first units from the Los Angeles Fire Department arrived, they found a scene that defied the neighborhood's reputation for security and peace. Paramedics confirmed what Romy's trauma had already signaled. Rob Reiner, 78, was dead, but as they cleared the rest of the suite, they made a second, equally devastating discovery. In an adjacent area of the master bedroom lay Michelle Singer Reiner. 70, like her husband, she had been the victim of a brutal, focused attack. There were no signs of a forced entry, no evidence of a robbery gone wrong. The valuable art remained on the walls. The jewelry was untouched. The violence had been personal, intimate, and terrifyingly efficient. By 4:15 p.m., the Brentwood estate was transformed into a high-stakes forensic laboratory. Yellow tape cordoned off the driveway where paparazzi and news crews were already beginning to gather, drawn by the sirens and the whispered name of the victim. The LAPD's Robbery-Homicide Division took command of the scene. Detectives moved through the house with a somber precision, documenting a timeline of horror. The medical examiner's preliminary findings suggested that the couple had been dead for several hours, possibly since the late hours of Saturday night or the very early morning of Sunday. The cause of death for both was identified as multiple sharp force injuries, stab wounds delivered with such ferocity that the struggle had been over within minutes. As the technical investigation began, a secondary team focused on the family's recent movements. It was discovered that the Reiners had attended a holiday gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien the night before. Witnesses at the party began to provide the first pieces of a disturbing puzzle. They described an evening where the director's public grace seemed to slip. Rob had been seen in a tense, hushed conversation with his son, Nick Reiner, 32, Those nearby described Nick's behavior as increasingly erratic, his movements agitated, his eyes darting. One guest recalled a moment toward the end of the night where Rob had placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that was met not with affection, but with a cold, defensive withdrawal. The family had left the party early, retreating into the privacy of their Brentwood home. The search for Nick Reiner became the immediate priority of the LAPD. He was nowhere to be found at the crime scene, and his phone was dark. An all-points bulletin was issued, but detectives were careful to keep the search quiet to avoid a high-speed pursuit in the crowded Sunday traffic. The investigation turned toward the digital footprint of the family, emails, text messages, and home security footage. While the cameras outside showed the family vehicle arriving home after the party, the internal system had been mysteriously deactivated shortly after midnight. As night fell over Los Angeles, the city struggled to process the news. The director of Stand By Me and The Princess Bride, a man who had spent his life exploring the nuances of human connection and the triumph of the spirit, had met an end that was the antithesis of his work. The investigation was no longer just about a crime. It was about a family's private agony becoming public property. Forensic teams recovered a discarded weapon, a common kitchen knife, near the rear of the property. Its presence, a mundane tool, turned into an instrument of absolute tragedy. At 9:30 p.m., the search reached its conclusion. Nick Reiner was located in the Exposition Park neighborhood, miles from the affluent streets of Brentwood. He was found sitting in a parked car, staring at nothing, a vacant expression on his face that investigators would later describe as utterly detached. He did not resist arrest. He was taken into custody and booked on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The initial interrogation yielded little. Nick remained largely silent, his only response to the gravity of the charges being a series of unintelligible murmurs. But as the police processed him, they noticed something that would send a chill through the entire department. Among his personal effects was a handwritten note, dated only days prior, that spoke of the final cut and a cleansing of the legacy. It wasn't a confession, but a window into a mind that had been unraveling long before the first blow was struck. In the aftermath of the arrest, the silence that had once shrouded the Brentwood estate was replaced by a cacophony of public debate, mourning, and deep psychological inquiry. As the legal machinery began to grind, the world looked back at the life of Rob Reiner, trying to reconcile the warmth of his cinematic legacy with the cold, sharp finality of his end. The investigation moved from the blood-spattered bedroom to the more abstract terrain of the human mind, seeking to understand the why behind an act that seemed to defy every instinct of nature. The deep dive into Nick Reiner's history revealed a landscape of long-standing fractures. At 32, Nick had spent more than half his life in a cycle of addiction, recovery, and relapse, a journey that had begun in his mid-teens. While his father was a titan of the industry, Nick had struggled to find solid ground, navigating a world where he was often defined by the shadow of a legend. This struggle was not a secret. It had been the central theme of their collaborative 2016 film, Being Charlie, a project that at the time felt like a public exorcism of their shared trauma. It was supposed to be a bridge, a way to heal the dark years through the very medium that had made Rob a star. But in the cold light of 2025, that bridge appeared to have collapsed under a weight too heavy for celluloid to bear. Forensic psychologists began to piece together a profile of a man whose mental health had been quietly deteriorating for months. Associates described Nick's increasing fixation on legacy and purity, an obsession that seemed to turn the very successes of his father into a perceived burden or even a personal affront. The loud argument at Conan O'Brien's party was not just a family spat. It was, according to investigators, the ignition point. Witnesses recalled Nick asking guests if they were famous, his tone mocking and hollow, as if the very concept of Hollywood recognition had become a source of profound resentment. The social and moral consequences radiated outward, touching every corner of the industry. The tragedy became a focal point for a broader, more uncomfortable conversation about the pressures of celebrity, families, and the often unseen toll of chronic mental health crises in the upper echelons of society. Even the political sphere was not immune to the shockwaves. A series of inflammatory posts from political figures attempting to weaponize the tragedy drew widespread condemnation, highlighting a societal fracture where even a moment of profound family grief could be reduced to a partisan talking point. This only added to the sense of a world that had lost its moral compass, a sentiment mirrored in the outpouring of tributes from those like Billy Crystal and Carrie Elwes, who spoke of a man whose heart was as expansive as his filmography. Legally, the case entered a period of procedural stagnation. In early 2026, the defense team, led by high-profile attorneys, argued that the state of California's laws regarding mental competency would play a decisive role. They claimed that Nick was not guilty of murder, under the specific legal interpretations of his psychological state at the time of the attack. For the remaining Reiner children, Jake and Romy, the process was an agonizing, slow-motion replay of their parents' final moments. They remained largely silent, their occasional public statements characterized by a dignified, hollowed-out grief, asking for the privacy to mourn their best friends. In a world that wouldn't stop watching, the unanswered questions continue to hang over the Brentwood estate like a persistent coastal fog. Was there a specific moment where the cleansing mentioned in Nick's note became an inevitability? Could the warning signs at the party have been interpreted as more than just another episode in a long history of erratic behavior? The house itself was eventually put on the market, but it stood empty for a long time, a grand monument to a life of storytelling that ended with a narrative no one wanted to write. As the sun sets on this chapter of Hollywood history, we are left with the images Rob Reiner gave us, the bonds of childhood friends walking a train track, the enduring power of a Twee Wolf story, and the laughter of a mockumentary that went to 11. But those images are now filtered through a different lens. The man who taught the world how to find the beauty in the journey met an end that offered no resolution, no redemption, and no final bow. It is a reminder that even the most celebrated lives can be undone by the ghosts that linger in the halls of home. The truth is rarely pure and never simple. It is often found in the silence after the screaming stops, in the empty spaces of a family portrait, and in the chilling realization that some stories don't end with a happily ever after, but with the quiet, devastating click of a door being locked from the inside. This concludes the investigation into the hidden truth behind the final days of Rob and Michelle Reiner. What story would you like me to examine next?